So Zac, we're very grateful for you coming today. Zac, of course,
Thank you.
grew up in Bath, Maine. Went to Morris High School, on to the University of Maine, where he majored in archaeology and history. He then went on to take a job down in Florida, then Maryland, and then for 15 years he lived out in Oklahoma City, along with the photographer back there, Chuck Rand, who was there about the same time. And after that, while he was down in Oklahoma City, he was very nostalgic and missed Maine so much. So he began writing various different kind of Facebook pages and archives and journals about Maine. And soon on Facebook, he had 5,000 different followers and fans. Because of that, the Coastal Journal hired him to write articles for the Coastal Journal, which he did for 3 years, and then the,
The Forecaster. Yeah.
Forecaster hired him for a number of years to write history articles there as well. So congratulations on all that. Sadly,
Thank
it came
you.
to an end with COVID, but nevertheless, you continue to write for that wonderful new, what is it called? The Facebook page called The Good Old Days of Bath, Maine. So you can tune into that particular blog and continue reading about Maine history by Zac McDorr. So Zac, thank you for joining us. Let's give a warm welcome.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Okay.
Yep.
Yes, I've always loved history since I was a little boy. I collected anything that looked old, as my mother will tell you. And it's really nice to be here today. Thank you so much for coming. So I am from Bath, Maine. And, I'm from Bath, Maine. One of the reasons I'm proud to be from Bath, Maine is that 2 of Maine's first governors actually came from the area. First one was this guy, Sir William Phipps. If you go back to the 1600s, Maine was or Maine and Massachusetts, it was all controlled by 2 different groups, really. There was the Plymouth colony, which owned the Kennebec Valley and traded furs and that sort of thing. And then part of it was owned by the Massachusetts colony, and they came together as one around 1691. And that's how Maine and Massachusetts came together as one unit. And this was the first governor, Sir William Phipps. Sadly, he's not actually from Bath, and he's not from Phippsburg, just south of Bath, which would make sense. That's named after him. He was born and raised in Woolwich, just across the river. One of somewhere between 16 and 26 children. No one's exactly sure. It's possible his parents lost track of how many kids there were. But it's interesting to think of how somebody who was one of all these children who grew up literally in the middle of nowhere, this was the wild frontier at the time, how did he become the first governor of Maine and Massachusetts? And if you followed politics, you probably won't be surprised that a lot of money switched hands. That's how it happened. So he grew up in Woolwich, learned the shipbuilding trade, moved to Boston, did some more shipbuilding, came back, and he began building a ship here. And when he was almost done, King Philip's War started. The natives attacked this whole area, burned everything, the Clarkin Lake settlement. And he had a whole cargo set up ready to ship out and make some money. But he left it there on the dock and loaded his ship with colonists and rescued them and took them to Boston, which ruined him financially, but made him a hero to everybody. And there's a lot of reasons I love this guy and why he's one of my favorite historical characters. He was the first successful underwater treasure hunter, actually. He went down to the Caribbean, put together a group of investors and so forth. He found a sunken galleon called the Conception, and using 3 native pearl divers to do all the actual work, he recovered 46 tons of treasure from the ship. Silver, gold, and jewels, which at the time was about $1.3 million in 1600s money. His investors got most of it. He ended up with about $80,000, which made him extremely wealthy. And he turned over 10% of the treasure to the king which is how he ended up being Sir William Phipps. He was knighted for that. And he was named as Provost Marshal for Massachusetts. Another reason I love this guy, oh, there he is, yeah, hauling up the treasure. That must have been a fun time. Another reason he's interesting, he was governor of Maine and Massachusetts during the Salem witch trials. And if you're wondering why he didn't put a stop to this horrible thing, it's because after the treasure thing, he went on a few military expeditions against the French. One was successful, one was very bad. But he ended up here in Pemaquid building the first Fort William Henry. So during the Salem witch trials, he was here, didn't know what was going on. And when he went back, he found out all this had been happening. And even worse, he found out his own wife had been accused of witchcraft. So if you want to put an end to the Salem witch trials, accuse the governor's wife of witchcraft. He put an end to it pretty quick. And so he put a stop to that. The last reason I like this guy is he had the coolest funeral invitation I've ever seen. I totally plan to rip this off in the future. Remember to die, it says. You don't want to forget that. There's skulls and just absolutely fantastic. Buried in England now. But we're not here to talk about him. We're here to talk about one of these guys. I call these the We Three Kings of Maine here. You got William. We'll talk about the other two some other day. But William King, William King is a neighbor of mine, I'm happy to say. My house is right here in Bath, and right across the intersection is Maple Grove Cemetery, where he resides today. Anytime I want, I can go across the street and hang out with him. He's got the biggest marker in the cemetery. Due to the pandemic, we're keeping a 6-foot distance here, as you can see. Wah, wah. All right. But anyway, I've always admired successful people who've been able to succeed at things. But I really admire people like Leonardo da Vinci and Ben Franklin, people who were able to succeed in just so many different things over the course of their life. In King's life, he went from having nothing to being maybe the richest man in the state. He owned lumber yards, sawmills, stores, timberland, and farms. He started his own shipping empire, was the biggest ship owner in Maine. Built the first turnpike between Bath and Brunswick. He owned a huge property about 2 miles north of Bath called the Million Acre Farm, he called it, which included Kingfield, this town he started, named after himself, and a few other towns. Started the first bank in Bath and was president of others. The trustee of the Marine Insurance Company in Boston. He served in the Massachusetts Senate and House of Representatives. Commanded the Maine militia in the War of 1812. Helped fund Bowdoin College and Colby College. Led the movement to repeal the coasting law, was the driving force between making Maine a state, and was Maine's first governor. So quite a guy. So what kind of man can accomplish all that in his life? What was he like? It's hard to know after 170 years what somebody was like, unless they were a public figure and people wrote about them, which fortunately he was. And I'll read a few descriptions of him to you that I found. I think you'll see he had a very powerful personality, a very powerful ambition, and something else that was very powerful that a lot of people noticed. I think you'll see. So Mrs. A.S. Swayze said, "I remember so well the old governor, his courtly presence, his heavy brow and overhanging eyebrows and searching eyes, his firm mouth which so readily softened into a smile as he took the hand of a little child." John Shepherd said, "In his person he was tall and of a striking figure, and with a finely formed head, strongly marked features, high forehead, and black impending brows. He had a natural and majestic air of command which impressed every beholder with respect. He had his faults, but he had many admirers." J.F. Anderson said, "I was but a lad of 7 years, and he was at least 65. His large frame and heavy voice seemed too gigantic, just my ideal of a real governor of the old school. The sound of his voice seemed to echo grimly from the deep concaves of his eyes, which from under their forest-like brows would sternly look a command that was not to be resisted by ordinary mortals." So, power eyebrows are part of his success, I believe. Everybody. I've not trimmed mine since I read this, I'll tell you. And one more from John Shepherd. In a brief sentence, his character may be summed up. If riding out on horseback for pleasure he met a beggar asking alms, he would relieve him in a moment. But let him be in hot haste after some distant object, and the grand old general would ride over that very mendicant, nor cast a lingering look behind. So, obviously very powerful type A personality here, very ambitious and driven, and just the kind of guy that usually becomes very successful. Now, it could be that his father was an influence on that. His father was, in fact, a successful ship owner and merchant who became quite wealthy before the Revolution. His name was Richard King, and he lived in Scarborough. When he started out, he built this little place, and then as he became richer, he added on to it. I don't know if that's really a mansion, but it was a nice place. And he did real well until the Revolution started. There were some hard times, and he loaned out some money to some folks to help him get by. And one of the best ways to be hated is to have a whole bunch of people that owe you money. So at some point, people that owed him money painted their faces black, called themselves the Sons of Liberty, smashed into his house, and just trashed the inside and destroyed all of his financial papers. Later on, when the Revolution happened, he didn't support the war. It was bad for his business, and he thought without the protection of the English, the French might come down from Canada and take over Maine. So he didn't support the war, and he was accused of being a Tory. And so a bunch of Minuteman types forced him to stand on a table in a tavern and declare his loyalty to the cause. And so his business suffered, his health suffered, and he died at the age of 57 when William King was only 7 years old. So it's hard to say how much of an influence he was on William, being so young when he died. But there's no doubt that his children proved to be very successful. William King, we already talked about, very successful. He had another son named Cyrus, who was a successful attorney before he died young. His older son, Rufus, was probably the most successful of all. He was a successful attorney. He was a member of the Continental Congress and signed the Constitution. He was a U.S. Senator. He was the last Federalist presidential candidate who got wiped out by James Monroe. But he was made minister to Britain by George Washington, and at the end of his life, he was once again the British ambassador. So probably the most successful of the bunch right here. So something going on with the family. The girls didn't have the same opportunities, obviously, but two of them married doctors. Betsy married, let's see, Dr. Benjamin Porter in 1786, and that would become William King's first and most important business partner. So the Founding Fathers get a lot of criticism these days for not passing on the freedom to everybody, obviously. But one thing they did do is they got rid of the aristocracy that British had been living under for more than 1,000 years and replaced it with the meritocracy, or the idea of the meritocracy. And this became part of the American story, the rags to riches story. The man born in a log cabin that becomes president. And William King was a big part of that. That was his story too. He left in 1791, left Scarborough. Famously, he had nothing but a cart and some oxen wearing rags and barefoot. And that part probably wasn't true. His family wasn't that bad off. And he did own some land that he'd inherited from his father, but it was not productive. So this is about all he had in 1791. And he went to Topsham to live with his sister and her husband, the Porters. Being ambitious, he went to work in a sawmill. He had some experience with that. And immediately saved up his money and bought into the mill. So he became owner of the mill pretty quickly. Him and his partner, Dr. Porter. And just within a couple of years, he owned a farm, he owned timberland, he owned the mill. Within a few years after that, he was representing Maine down in Boston. Quite a meteoric rise. They also had a store in Topsham. He mostly did the lumber stuff. His partner did the store. He didn't know much about it, apparently. There's a story where he was in the store one day, and a lady came up to him with some pins and said, "How much for the pins?" And he said, "I guess a penny a piece." And she said, "I can buy them anywhere else, 5 for a penny." And he said, "Well then, toss them all out. I won't have anything in my store that's worth less than a cent." So he wasn't big on the small details. He was the big picture guy. So now it was time to make some serious money. His lumber yards could produce lumber. 1,000 board feet cost him about $8 to make. It could be sold in the West Indies for $60 to $100. So huge money to be made. Also, he had farms that he would put his produce together, and salted meat and other wooden products like prefab houses even, and barrels. And unfortunately, there was no way to ship things unless you owned a ship. So, hey, welcome.
Hi.
We went to the wrong place.
Oh yeah, sorry about that. So Porter and King began building ships in Brunswick and Topsham. They built 5. They bought 2 more, and they began shipping their products down to the West Indies and over to England and making a ton of money. And they did well for a while. Let's see, yes. So they would send the wood and stuff down there, make a big profit. And then they'd load the ship with sugar, molasses, and rum, bring that back up here and sell that for a huge profit. Now, King wasn't a drinker himself. He did serve wine at his table, but he was happy to sell the rum to anybody that wanted it. And rum was a very important product at that time. In Reed's History of Bath, 1894, he tells a funny story about a farmer in Bath that tried to do a barn raising, but he was against alcohol, so he refused to serve rum. And so nobody would work with him. All the men came just to laugh at him and jeer at him. No one would pick up a hammer because he refused to serve rum. And the guy had to build his barn with women and children doing the labor. So, yeah, so much money to be made. One of the difficult parts, though, was the United States was a weak country. It was new. Their trading partners, England and France, controlled much of the world, really. But they didn't get along with each other. They'd been fighting for hundreds and hundreds of years. And that would cause a lot of trouble for them later on in life. But the first signs of that were in 1799. Their ship, the Nymph, was captured by Spanish privateers. The captain was thrown into prison in Cuba, and they lost their cargo and the ship and everything. And then a few months later, their ship, Osiris, was captured by French privateers. The captain and crew managed to take back the ship and sail it to England and turn over the French to the authorities, but King lost $35,000 on that one voyage, which in today's money is about $750,000. So you can see just how much money we're talking about. That was one voyage, $750,000 in today's money. It would get worse later. So, King moved to Bath. Bath is a better place to build ships. Has a nice river right down. Oh yeah, there's the West Indies. It's a great place to build ships because it's just a straight shot to the ocean. And he moved to Bath in 1800, started a shipyard right about where the Carlton Bridge now ends on the bank. And he started to build a house where the current customs house is. And he needed a lady to live there with him, obviously. So he spent a lot of time in Boston, had business associates down there. One was named John Fraser, and he had an 18-year-old sister named Anne, who was shy and withdrawn, and exactly the opposite of him, obviously. So they fell in love, and he married her and took her back to Bath to live in his new house. I don't have a picture of what his house looked like when he lived there. It was about a story and a half. Later on, when the customs house was built, it was moved a block down the road to where his shipyard had been. And they added a story and a half and turned it into a hotel. So this was King's house, but very modified. Later on, they modified it even further and renamed it the King Tavern. Unfortunately, it was in the way when they built the Carlton Bridge in 1927. They tore it down. So that house is gone. Right here is downtown Bath. These buildings still exist. This hotel burned in 1894. This church is long gone, although they call it the church block. But King lived right here behind this building. That's where his house was. And right across the street was this building he built, which he had his offices on the second floor, ran his bank out of the downtown. So everything was right there. He had his house, he had his building across the street, he had a shipyard right next to him. Nowadays, there's a brick building here that has a coffee shop in it. The only thing that still exists is this carved eagle on the top that's at the Maine Maritime Museum today. That wasn't his only house. Up in Kingfield, which was a long ways away from Bath, he had his own little town up there, and he built his own house for when he was up there. This house too is gone. It burned down, and there's nothing but a plaque. The only one that still exists is this house. It's called Stonehouse Farm in North Bath. It's a very mysterious building. No one's sure exactly when it was built or who built it, whether it was King or somebody else. No one knows why it looks like this. Some people think it was made to look like a church in case Bath was ever attacked. Maybe they wouldn't attack this building. But he used this as a hunting lodge and as a farm to make produce for his shipping business. And if you like the looks of it, it's for sale right now for $1.3 million. So, which isn't a bad price because it's a huge house, 48 acres, a barn, a swimming pool. It's actually not a bad deal for something so historic. So that's still around. And I was able to tour it once and sit in the room where William King used to sit and talk about making Maine a state. So, let's see. So Massachusetts and Maine were not physically together, so it was kind of like a long-distance relationship, which often doesn't work out, as you know. Other things that make relationships work include, having each other's back, agreeing about politics and religion. And Maine and Massachusetts did not agree on any of that stuff. William King was a Congregationalist, so it's kind of cool to be here in this Congregational church. They would meet in this old one-room schoolhouse in Bath, which was torn down in the 1930s, unfortunately. But it was too small, so they built a church called the Old North Church. And King and his friends got together and bought a bell from Paul Revere, which still hangs in the Bath City Hall today. My daughter here got to ring it. We got to be up on the roof. They only ring it once a year now because it's so fragile. They have a whole ceremony. And I used to think Bath was really cool because we had this Paul Revere bell, but I did an article on it, and it turns out there's 6 or 7 others in Maine. Wiscasset has one. The old St. Patrick Church has one, so maybe we're not that cool, but I still like it. The Congregationalists had to hire a minister and ended up with a schism. The conservative group and the liberal group couldn't decide on a minister. So William King and his friends packed up and built their own church about a half-mile south called the Old South Church. So you had two congregational churches, one more liberal, which was his, and one more conservative. Eventually, a few years later, this building ended up being vacant, and it was rented to the wave of Irish Catholics that were coming over from the famine, and was therefore burned down by a mob in the 1850s. One of the saddest parts of Bath history was this 3-day riot that took place. It was the Know Nothing Party. They were anti-Irish, anti-Catholic. They burned the church. At one point, they tried to tie a rope around an Irishman's house and drag it into the river. But the landlord came out with a hatchet and hacked the rope in half. But William King probably didn't care at that point. The two halves of the Congregational Church had moved on and built new buildings, which thankfully are still there today. They were supposed to be torn down in the 70s. But this is the Winter Street Church, built 1843, and we call this the Chocolate Church now. It's the Central Church. Neither one is actually a church anymore, unfortunately, but they still exist. And then I think in the 1960s or 70s, finally, after almost 200 years or whatever, the two congregations came back together and built a new church in Bath, and we're together once more. Unfortunately, membership declined, and now they meet in a very small building that used to be a gas station. But it's a very historic congregation. Anyway, he was Congregationalist, and the people running Massachusetts were Congregationalists. But here in Maine, there was a growing diversity. You had a lot more Baptists coming in who were trying to start a college in Waterville. Then they did not feel supported by the guys in Boston. And there were a lot of Methodists coming in who felt discriminated against by the guys in Boston. And eventually, the two groups together would be able to outvote the Federalists. The next thing is politics. William King started out as a Federalist. George Washington and John Adams were Federalists. And the way I've heard it described, these guys believed that the government should be run by wealthy, educated gentlemen, and that the point of the people was just to come together every 4 years and pick which gentleman should be running the show. But not everyone believed that, obviously. A lot of people thought the common man should have more say in government. And so a new political party called the Democratic Republicans came along. They were led by Thomas Jefferson. As time goes on, because of the embargo that Thomas Jefferson would do, the Federalists would really harden against him in Boston, while Maine would become more and more Democratic Republican over time. So the two different parties were controlling the two different parts of the state. Okay, so things really got bad in 1807 when Thomas Jefferson was president. Napoleon was in charge of France, and he decided that the only way he'd be able to conquer England is to stop ships from trading with England. So he decided that any neutral country trying to trade with England, their ships would be captured. And then England said, well, okay, any ship trying to trade with France will be captured. So all of a sudden, we could not trade with anybody. And our ships were in trouble. So Thomas Jefferson came up with a thing called the embargo of 1807, which basically said American ships were not allowed to leave and trade with anybody except for other ports in America. And this was absolutely devastating to all traders. In Bath alone, there were some 50 ships just sitting there, some loaded, some not, going nowhere. William King estimated he was losing about $5,500 a month, which is about $125,000 a month today. So it was really hard for him, but he didn't think it would last very long. He continued building ships in order to give employment to all the starving people around. Unfortunately, it did last a long time. It lasted 2 years until 1809. It was very, very difficult. It was difficult on everybody, and like I said, the Federalists of Massachusetts blamed him for the hardship and became very strong Federalists. People in Maine continued to be Democratic Republicans because they thought the Federalists only cared about rich people. Now, because of all this insecurity, people of Maine wanted protection from the Massachusetts government. And so the Massachusetts government named William King Major General of the militia, even though he had no military training whatsoever. But he was very proud of that title and called himself General for the rest of his life. Things got bad, and after another 3-month embargo, the War of 1812 started. Now, things weren't too bad in New England at first. A lot of trading continued between New England and England. Pretty much all the goods people needed here came from England. The United States was not much of a manufacturing hub at that point. And because, so the federal government wanted to call up 100,000 troops. Massachusetts refused to send any. They didn't want to be any part of this war or any part of it. And so the federal government actually went around Massachusetts and started talking directly to William King and asking him to come up with troops, which he did. But trading continued. Trading came across the border from Canada. There were ships. There's a funny story where a British ship came to the mouth of the Kennebec during the War of 1812 and sent word to William King that he wanted to sail in and have dinner with him in his house. And William King sent back a letter saying, if you sail up the river, you'll have dinner in hell. So he wasn't going to hang out with these people, but he would buy their products through neutral countries or some other way. The British seemed to think that maybe because of all this Massachusetts not wanting to be involved, maybe New England would actually secede from America and rejoin Canada and be under the British flag once more. The reason we got involved in the war, in large part, was because the British were stealing sailors off of our ships. A lot of sailors were leaving British ships and joining American ships because the working conditions were better. They were asking for citizenship and getting it, but when the British ships pulled them over, they didn't care about that so-called American citizenship. They were British citizens, and they took them back along with thousands of Americans that they told themselves were probably British. And that ticked us off. Another thing that happened was one of King's ships called the Margaretta, he partially owned it, came to the Kennebec River, and it was actually escorted by a British warship called the Boxer. And when they got to the mouth of the river, to make things look good, the Boxer fired off a few shots in the general direction of the merchant ship. But this was heard by an American ship called the Enterprise, and then they did battle, and it was a win for America, probably the biggest win in Maine, naval history to this point. Both sea captains were killed, and they were buried next to each other in a cemetery in Portland, which is kind of interesting. But this all started because the British ship was actually helping an American ship bring its goods into Maine. Eventually, the British figured out Maine was not going to secede and rejoin Canada, so they kind of took it to us here. They put a blockade along the coast, and they invaded Maine and took over this whole eastern part here, all the way to Bangor, Eastport, Castine. These places were now controlled by the British. And Massachusetts was doing nothing about it. They didn't want to be involved in the war. So these poor people looked to their state government for help and got nothing. So the federal government turned to William King. They asked him to raise 5,000 troops and take back Castine with it. Now, up to this point, he had been commanding the defense. He had been building fortifications, and he did raise 5,000 men with no financial help from the government. They didn't have any money to give him. So he had to raise the money, he had to get the armament, he had to get the men to sign up. And he was all set to attack Castine and take it back when the war ended. And the treaty said that all previous territory would return to whoever owned it before. So that turned back into Maine. He did get a nice letter from the president saying, I'm sure you would have succeeded if you had attacked him. And I'm sure he would have. So, why were Maine and Massachusetts kind of separated? Massachusetts was firmly in control of the Federalists. Maine was becoming more democratic Republican. Massachusetts was Congregationalist. Maine had a growing population of Baptists and Methodists. Boston was the hub of government. So anytime you had to do any kind of official government business, you had to travel all the way down here, which was a long journey in those days. In fact, there's a funny story about Bangor. It was supposed to be named Sudbury, and they sent a minister all the way down here to Boston to register the town and the name. And while he was there, he was humming an Irish hymn called Bangor. And the judge said, what do you want to name the town? And he thought he said, what are you whistling? So he said, Bangor. That's how I got to be the name. And by the time he got back up here, it's too late to send him all the way back. So it just shows you how difficult it was dealing with Boston all the time. People of Maine were very unimpressed with how Massachusetts had not protected them during the War of 1812. Mainers didn't really want to pay taxes to Massachusetts. And so there was a lot of feeling that Mainers wanted to separate. But the first few times they voted, it was turned down. And there was a couple of reasons for this. First one was called the coasting law. The law at that time, it's hard to believe, but if you were going to sail a cargo down the coast of the United States, you had to pull in at every state and pay customs and duties. That was the custom law. Now, the most trade happened between Maine and Boston. There were no custom duties to be paid because it was the same state. So they were able to bypass New Hampshire. But if Maine became its own state, it would now have to pay taxes and duties here and all the way down. So that was one of the big stumbling blocks. So William King realized he was going to have to get rid of that in order for Maine to become a state. So he talked to his brother Rufus, who was in the Senate, and got his support. He talked to the Secretary of the Treasury, who wanted to become president and wanted King's support. So he agreed to fight for this. And sure enough, the coasting law was eventually repealed. And after that, Maine did vote to become a state in 1819, to separate. Now, another problem was slavery. At the time that the United States was formed, each state was allowed to decide for itself whether it wanted to be a slave state or not. Sounds horrible, but that was the only way at the time for everyone to come together as one nation. The southern states would never have joined with the United States if slavery had been off the table. And over the years, as states had been added, the power balance had been maintained, and there was an equal number of senators from free states, an equal number of senators from slave states. And this was very important to them at the time. In fact, when California was admitted as a free state, part of the deal was they had to send at least one pro-slavery senator to Congress so that they wouldn't have more. One side wouldn't have more than the other. Pretty crazy. Now, while he was fighting with the English, Napoleon had sold this whole part of America to us. Louisiana Purchase, you've heard of that. After Louisiana became a state, this territory became called the Missouri Territory. And Missouri now wanted to become a state, and they wanted to be a slave state. And this upset some people up here, obviously. For a long time, it had kind of been believed that slavery was on its way out. It didn't really make sense anymore. Until Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin, at which time they could process huge amount of cotton, and they needed a lot of people to pick it. So all of a sudden, slavery made this big comeback. And this kind of looked like slavery was spreading, and that was a bad thing. So, Maine wants to become a state, but if they do, the free states will have 2 more senators than the slave states. Missouri wants to be a state. If they become a state, then slave states will have 2 more senators than the free states. So along comes the Missouri Compromise, which said, these guys up here said, we don't want to have the spread of slavery. We'll go ahead and let Missouri have slaves, but everybody else above this line, this will all be free territory with no slavery. And so Missouri got to become a state, and Maine got to become a state. Later on, the Dred Scott decision you've heard of annulled the Missouri Compromise and said Missouri federal government can't tell people whether or not they can have slavery. And that kind of led to the Civil War. But this Missouri Compromise kind of kept things the way they were and prevented the war for about 40 years. But Maine did become a state. A lot of people were unhappy about that in Maine. Like, Maine becoming a state has something to do with more slavery over here. So these people didn't like the Missouri Compromise. And these people didn't like the Missouri Compromise because they believed that states should still have the right, each one, to decide whether it was a slave state or not. So, Maine is now a state. The guy who did the most to make that happen was William King. And so he was almost unanimously voted governor of Maine, first governor. Still has the dark eyebrows here. It's going gray. He becomes the first governor of Maine and started to make some enemies. Everybody wanted to be appointed some kind of post in the new government. He couldn't appoint everybody, so some people got upset. And he did his best, but about a year after he became governor, Florida was starting to join the Union. A whole bunch of sailors, I don't actually understand how it happened, but a bunch of sailors were suing the Spanish government, and the Spanish government said, well, United States, if you'll pay all these claims, we'll just give you Florida. And they wanted William King to be involved in that, so he quit being governor after a year and went down and started getting involved in that Florida stuff. So, business was on and off for him. Right after the War of 1812, things were very bad. In 1816, there was a volcanic eruption that cooled the earth for a while, and there was no summer that year. No crops were able to grow. It just snowed on and off all year. And that was devastating to the economy. And so he had some years, some good years and some bad years, until 1830s. In the 1830s, Colonel Jackson, Andrew Jackson, became president. And he was the first president of a new party called the Democrats. And there were a lot of things he didn't like. He didn't like the Indians very much. He was the guy behind the Trail of Tears. But he was a populist who did not like banks because he thought they only benefited the wealthy. So when William King's bank came up for charter, it was denied, and he lost his bank. And he lost another bank in Wiscasset that he was president of. And the Secretary of the Treasury for the United States had put a lot of money into this bank. Now he wanted it back. King had to pay it out of his own pocket. On top of that, he was the collector of customs for Bath, which was a big port at the time. And Andrew Jackson refused to give him that job again. He wanted a Democrat in that position. So he lost his job and his bank and most of his money. Very sad. Also, there were new tariffs put in place that made it very hard to make any money off of the West Indies, which was his business. So things really got rough. He owned property all over the place, and he began having to sell it off. 1835, he was nominated for governor by the Whig Party and was absolutely murdered in that election. He lost badly. And that was the last time he ever ran for office. He had been the master of Bath society forever. No one ever questioned this guy. But there was a new group of young men that got together, didn't like the old school. And at a town meeting, he was speaking, and these guys were popping up all over the room, just challenging him and making fun of him. And he said, what is this? There's a cockadoodle over here, and a cockadoodle over here, and a cockadoodle everywhere. And what does it mean? But for the first time in his life, he was being challenged. He'd always just run everything in Bath. By 1843, this previously rich guy was forced to take out a mortgage on his property in Bath. He had 2 children. His son Cyrus was kind of a wild troublemaker. He wasn't home very much anyway. And this kid was just running wild along the dockyards and shipyards in Bath. Couldn't be controlled, so he was sent off to a private school and pretty much never had much of a relationship with his father after that. His daughter Mary Elizabeth, who had always suffered from convulsions, died in 1847. That seemed to take all the wind out of his sails right there. Businesses were crumbling. His ships were rotten. He couldn't fix them. He could barely trade. A whole new group of shipbuilders was coming into Bath, building much bigger ships. If you walk around Bath, a lot of homes have plaques on them that tell you when they were built. Huge number of them were built right around 1850. It was a huge boom in town. And there were all these new family dynasties building ships and being wealthy traders, the Pattons and the Sewells. And by this time, he was an old man. He was about done. It's too bad. He couldn't compete with any of those folks. In fact, after his daughter died, they took away control of his finances. He couldn't handle it anymore. He had pledged $6,000 to Bowdoin College. He had been kind of active in Bowdoin College for a long time. At one point, his partner, Porter, had pledged a lot of money to Bowdoin. And then there was a flood that wiped him out, took away $10,000 worth of logs and destroyed the mill. And Porter was unable to pay, and King was his guarantor, so he had to pay those bills. And Bowdoin went after him pretty hard. He was kind of mad about it and went over and helped start Colby College instead. But still, at the end of his life, he was supposed to donate $6,000 for the chapel at Bowdoin. And his wife had to withdraw. They just didn't have the money. And Bowdoin was supposed to name it after King. But even though they withdrew the money, he had done so much for the school, they still named it King Chapel. And it's still called that today. In 1851, his million-acre farm, Kingfield, all that was taken and put up for auction. And 5 months before his death in 1852, the government took his house. He was still allowed to live there, but he lost over $11,000 that he owed. He lost his home. So absolute, complete collapse from nothing to richest guy in the state to nothing. I told my brother about that, and he said, well, that's the way it goes. You come in with nothing and you leave with nothing. At least he got to spend most of his life rich and powerful. Which is true, but it must have been awful to see your whole life collapse before you. So he died in 1852. And Mainers realized they had lost probably the greatest man to come out of the state. And there was a huge procession from downtown Bath up North Street to the cemetery. They had bands and lodges and militiamen from all over the place, Bath, Richmond. And the bells in town tolled from the time they left till the time they got back. He really was a big deal in the town. And he's buried here today with his wife, son, his son's wife, his daughter. And there they are to this day. After he died, his book collection was purchased by the Patton brothers for $300. And that became the original core of the patent-free library that exists today. Now they're still there, locked up behind these cabinets. You can't check them out anymore, but they're still there. King's book collection, which was a lot of books for someone back then. And if you go to the U.S. Capitol in Washington, D.C., in the hallway you'll see the statue of William King representing Maine. So, quite a legacy. You might have lost everything, but if people are talking about you 170 years after you die, then you either did really bad things or really good things. And he did really good things, so. That's how Maine became a state, with William King. If you want to see, I brought a letter written by William King right here. And this book, I think, is out of print. It's very interesting. That's where I got most of my information from. General William King. If you can find a copy of that, it's good reading. So, thanks for coming, everybody.